Hello, folks. Welcome to another Powerful Words with Caleb. This is another blockbuster event. We look forward to, as always, here at Patriot Soapbox, giving you the content that you really look forward to seeing, and we thank you for showing up and giving us your time and attention. This evening, we're going to be discussing an item that has been prevalent in the Q drops throughout and has been given a reasonable amount of attention, but in my opinion, we have not thoroughly understood the circumstances surrounding the issues regarding Edward Snowden. So I do want to get into what I believe is a blockbuster story. And I will do this very quickly because it really does not require more than a concentration on two different articles. First thing I'm going to do is bring up one article. Bear with me for a second. I will bring that up for you. Okay, this is a study at Columbia Law School, or excuse me, Columbia School of Journalism regarding the Snowden issue. Okay, it's entitled Covert Activity, the Washington Post, Edward Snowden, and National Security Agency. This is blockbuster material, folks. I'm going to switch over to the beginning of this document, the title page. Covert Activity, Washington Post, Edward Snowden, and the National Security Agency. You do not see a date here, as this is a referencing the journalism school's case consortium at Columbia University regarding this event. Okay, this case takes place behind the scenes. Look at how a national security reporter works. In February 2013, reporter Barton Gelman first learns about a source who claims to have National Security Agency documents over the next 4 months. He and his collaborator, Laura Poitras, tried to verify whether the source is credible and the materials bona fide. The documents have true revealed details about an intrusive NSA program that swept up private communications on a scale unsuspected by most U.S. citizens or Congress. 9 internet companies gave the NSA access to the information. In late May, Gelman takes the story to the Washington Post, which agrees to work with him to publish it. Now, this fact, I'm going to interject here, the fact that this goes to the Washington Post answers many of the Q drops, and that's what I'm going to refer to here. And it will make pieces fall into place with regard to the larger puzzle. For several weeks, Gelman and the Post take the story through all stages of writing, editing, redacting material that might harm national security, and seeking comment from the government. The White House asks the newspaper to kill the story, and when the Post refuses, asks that at least it withhold the names of the 9 internet companies. Meanwhile, competitive pressures increase when the UK Guardian newspaper publishes a different story based on the same document trove. Gelman and the Post have to weigh issues of the public's right to know against the legitimate security interests of the U.S. government and decide what to publish. Popcorn to get you every time. Use this case to acquaint students with the daily challenges of national security reporting. Ask them what has changed about the pursuit since 9/11. Discuss the role of technology both in government surveillance techniques and in the media's ability to uncover government activities. Ask them about the competing interests of media and government. When is it appropriate for the two to cooperate, and when must they oppose one another? What role does national security coverage play in a democracy? What constitutes a verifiable source? How concerned should journalists be about encryption and protecting sources and materials? Use this case in a course class on national security reporting, investigative reporting, and editorial management. This case brings to mind a lot of questions, folks, especially in the environment in which we exist, because if they can look at the materials that we are reporting upon, then people who are sharing the information with us will be entirely reluctant to share that information unless there's some encryption. So reporters have gone encrypted, which is some source of concern here, and that's what our last show was dealing with quantum key distribution and the allowance of being able to encode or encrypt our cell phones. And I do have to publish a retraction of some sorts. I did use interchangeably in my last story. I noticed after watching it again that I used the words cryptography and or cryptology, systematically together, and they're really not the same thing, folks. I should have been referring to cryptology, and instead I mentioned cryptography a number of times. So please forgive me for that. I caught my own mistake, and I just want to follow up on that. Okay, what are we looking at here? Let's go to the introduction page. The U.S. press has long prided itself on the investigation of the secret doings of government. On occasion, the media honored government requests to hold back details or delay publication of a story if persuaded that disclosure would endanger a U.S. operation or American lives. But journalists took seriously their role as watchdogs and considered few institutions more important to watch than U.S. intelligence agencies. The Washington Post held it as an exalted position in the universe of watchdog media dating back to the days of Watergate, when its investigation resulted in the 1974 resignation of President Richard Nixon. Over the following decades, it fielded numerous sensitive national security stories, and as a rule, published them after notifying the target institution of its intention to do so. Granted, there remained a tension between the public's right to know about the national security operation and the government's insistence that secrecy contributed to success and saved lives. The Post considered each case on its merits. In June 2013, the Post found itself again with a story that had wide-ranging national security implications. Longtime national security reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner Barton Gellman, while no longer on staff, had brought the Post a dramatic story of widespread U.S. government surveillance of foreign communications, which incidentally had swept up millions of messages from private U.S. citizens. Gellman had been working periodically since February in a collaboration with documentary filmmaker Laura Poitras to check out whether their source, who continued to remain anonymous, was credible. They had never met, never talked on a telephone. The source, who called himself or herself Verax, had a classified document that demonstrated how, for a period of years, the National Security Agency, NSA, had been given access to the servers of 9 major U.S. internet companies and had secretly reviewed millions of communications. The targeted surveillance program, codenamed PRISM, had captured emails, texts, photos, and documents of suspect individuals on an unprecedented scale and unbeknownst to the public or to most members of Congress. Over months of encrypted electronic conversations, Gellman had determined to the extent possible that Verax's information checked out. By early June, Post Executive Director Martin Barron and the newspaper's legal team were prepared to publish the story. Gellman, per the Post's custom, had notified the White House about the story, and an official, after first asking that the article be killed, had requested that at least the Post not publish the names of the companies on the grounds that publication would destroy the arrangement and the hence threaten national security. As the Post debated its options, on Wednesday, June 5th, the British Guardian newspaper published a story about Verizon, not one of the 9, collecting telephone records for the NSA. Gellman knew that the Guardian story was based on documents from the same source. It was only a matter of time before the Guardian had the PRISM story as well. Gellman and the Post had a decision to make. Each internet company vehemently denied knowledge of the PRISM's program. The public might well react with outrage to the revelations, with severe economic consequences for the firms. The White House, meanwhile, was adamant that the names be withheld to preserve the program. The competitive pressure to publish was intense, but Gellman had to ask himself what the identities added to the story. Did the public's right to know include names? He had to draw on his wide experience reporting on national security matters to decide, identify the companies or not. Well, let's go on to the next phase of this document. Interesting. This is shaping up. We're going to go to the next page, which is a Washington Post, a brief history. Okay. The Washington Post, a brief history. The newspaper that dominated Washington, D.C. in the 21st century was founded in 1877 by Stilson Hutchins, a New Englander who later served as a state representative in Missouri to promote the agenda of the Democratic Party. Among others, the Post published Joseph Pulitzer and Theodore Roosevelt. But it fell on hard times in 1933. Republican financier Eugene Meyer bought it as a bankruptcy auction. The paper, he said, was mentally, morally, physically, and every other way bankrupt. Meyer set out to turn that around and articulated the paper's guiding principles, including tell all the truth so far as it can learn it. In 1946, Meyer stepped down to become president of the International Bank of Reconstruction, right after the war, of course. His son-in-law, Philip Graham, became publisher in 1947 when the Post incorporated. President in 1963, Graham committed suicide. Wow. And his widow, Catherine Meyer Graham, took over the Washington Post Company, which then included Newsweek. Her son, Donald Graham, became publisher in 1979. In 2008, a fourth-generation Meyer descendant, Catherine Weymouth, was named publisher and CEO of a new division, Washington Post Media, which included the newspaper and WashingtonPost.com. Donald Graham remained chairman and CEO of the Washington Post Company. During the Meyer-Graham years, the Post broke numerous stories and built a reputation that reached well beyond the confines of Washington. In 1971, it played a part in publishing the celebrated Pentagon Papers, a 7,000-page top-secret study of U.S. involvement in Indochina and the Vietnam War. A military analyst, Daniel Ellsberg, had leaked the documents to the New York Times. When a court temporarily enjoined the Times from further publication, the Post, which had obtained its own copy, published regardless. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually found in favor of the two newspapers, as Justice Hugo Black wrote. In my view, far from deserving condemnation for their courageous reporting, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other newspapers should be commended for serving the purpose that the Founding Fathers saw so clearly in revealing the workings of governments that led to the Vietnam War. The newspapers nobly did precisely that which the Founders hoped and trusted they would do. After the Supreme Court ruling, Graham said, "We are extremely gratified, not only from the point of view of newspapers, which was not the least of our concerns, but gratified with the point of view of government and the public's right to know, which is what we're concerned with." A year later, the Watergate scandal brought the Post global renown. In 1972, Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward investigated a curious break in the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate apartment complex. They found it led to President Nixon and his re-election campaign. By following a money trail and with the help of a federal source named Deep Throat, the two reporters uncovered numerous illegal activities. 2 years later, Nixon resigned. The Post won in 1973 Pulitzer for its coverage of Watergate. Not at all. Post reporting was of such import. The Post liked to define itself as a local paper, and it worked hard to cover responsibly the area where its readers lived. However, given that Washington was also the nation's capital, local, in its case, often meant issues of national or international scope. With the growth of the web and online publishing, Post readers increasingly came from all over the world. Not surprisingly, the paper had developed an expertise in a topic that regularly drew attention: national security. Onward to our next section, national security, reporting post 9/11. National security reporting had become more challenging since September 11, 2001. Attacks on the Pentagon and World Trade Center. First of all, the national security apparatus had grown exponentially. The Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and Department of Defense and others had increased spending and hired more staff and contractors with top security clearance. By 2011, the number of people with security clearance hit 4.2 million. The government's ability to spy on both foreign and domestic entities was also enhanced. Of course, I've clicked off the page, bear with me. The 1978 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, 78, FISA, already permitted warrantless electronic surveillance of individuals outside the U.S., as well as surveillance of U.S. citizens after obtaining permission from the FISA court, a panel of judges that met in secret. With time, domestic surveillance increased. In October 2001, President George W. Bush secretly authorized the NSA to collect domestic web, email, and phone records. FISA amendments in 2007 and 2008 gave private companies immunity if they cooperated with the U.S. government collection. U.S. intelligence collection. Did you know that U.S. corporations had immunity if they cooperated with the U.S. intelligence collection? as of 2007. At the same time, the executive branch reaction to security leaks had become more punitive. For example, in 2005, New York Times reporter Judith Miller was jailed for 85 days for refusing to identify the source that gave her the name of the CIA operative. The Department of Justice, under the administrations of both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama, threatened revitalized prosecution against leakers and recipients of classified information under the 1917 Espionage Act. In fact, from 2009 to early 2013, the Obama administration brought felony criminal charges against 6 individuals under the Espionage Act for leaking information to reporters. By comparison, the total for all previous administrations was 3. That was during the Obama administration. As a result, many confidential sources dried up. Several reporters who have covered national security in Washington for decades tell me that the environment has never been tougher or information harder to dislodge. Then New York Times editor Jill Abramson told the 2012 Conference on Investigative Reporters and Editors. Nonetheless, important stories went public. In December 2005, for example, the New York Times published a story by James Risen and Eric Lichtblau, which detailed how President George W. Bush had authorized the NSA to wiretap the international communications of Americans without court warrants. In 2006, USA Today broke the story that NSA under Bush had collected telephone records from millions of Americans. Controversially, the Times had held its story for a year at the administration's request. White House officials contended that the story would alert would-be terrorists that they were being watched. The Times published the claims coincidentally as Risen prepared to release a book that included a chapter on the NSA wiretapping. Bill Keller, when the Times executive editor, wrote, "We published the story when we did because after much hard work it was fully reported, checked and ready, and because after listening respectfully to the administration's objections, we were convinced there was no good reason not to publish it." The government did subpoena Risen, but ironically for information on his book other than the NSA material. Risen successfully fought a 2008 subpoena to testify to a federal grand jury about his source for an account in the book about a bought covert CIA program to feed information to Iran's nuclear weapons researchers. Risen had written a story about it in 2003, but the White House asked the Times not to publish, and the paper complied. But in 2010, former CIA officer Jeffrey Sterling was indicted under the Espionage Act for leaking classified information to Risen. When the subpoena for Risen was renewed in April, Risen again refused to testify, citing a reporter's privilege to keep sources confidential. WikiLeaks. Meanwhile, national security reporting and the relationship between media and government again took front stage in 2010. From July through November, the New York Times, in partnership with Der Spiegel and The Guardian, broke 3 sets of stories based on secret U.S. documents provided to whistleblower website WikiLeaks. The third set revealed the contents of confidential diplomatic cables. The Times and its partner, in contrast to WikiLeaks on previous occasions, were scrupulous about redacting the material in order to refrain from harming individuals or ongoing operations. The Times also let the White House know in advance that it was publishing and sought comment. In some ways, WikiLeaks series provided a textbook example of the U.S. media's approach to national security stories: inform the government and listen to its concerns, protect individuals, and make public as much material as possible. On to the next segment. Entitled First Contact. It was against this background that reporter Barton Gellman in February 2013 received an encrypted email from his friend and colleague, Laura Poitras, an award-winning American documentary filmmaker who had reported extensively on post-9/11 war on terror. The two had met in 2011 when both were fellows at New York University Center on Law and Security. Poitras had moved to Berlin after repeatedly encountering intense scrutiny at the U.S. border. As a journalist who tries to deal with work that the government is very interested in trying to keep secret, I feel an obligation to do whatever I can to protect the sources and the people that I'm working with, who are taking great risks to talk to me. Poitras told National Public Radio, "At the moment, it feels safer for me to work outside of the United States," which is a sad thing to say. Poitras told Gelman, she would be coming to New York City and asked whether they could meet on a confidential matter. Gelman was a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. He had covered the military and national security for Washington Post since 1990. In 1999, he moved to New York City but continued to work on special projects for the Post as well as nonfiction books. For his projects, Gelman often delved deep into classified material. In 2003, for example, he went to Iraq to write about whether it possessed weapons of mass destruction. Trying to unpack the truth of the WMD question in Iraq in 2003, which took me a whole year and brought me to Iraq twice. That was really difficult reporting, very murky, lots of classified material to deal with, he recalls. Another prominent project was a June 2007 series he co-authored about Vice President Dick Cheney, which eventually resulted in a book. Cheney for sure was the hardest project I had taken on to date, he comments. Gelman learned a valuable lesson from these experiences. To do their job, national security reporters often had to rely on material declared classified. If you want to know what's going on in foreign policy or wartime or intelligence policymaking or intelligence operations, everything that you want to know that isn't in congressional testimony or a news conference is basically going to be classified, he notes. Classification is rampant. Some of it is appropriate, some of it is close call, some of it is clearly unnecessary or classified for reasons that we shouldn't sanction, like to cover up embarrassment. But Gelman enjoyed any kind of reporting that examined power, how it was gained, and how it was used. National security policy often involved jockeying for power among a variety of constituents, he muses. I want to enable the normal checking powers that we say are important to us in the marketplace, in civil society, in politics, and law. None of those checks can operate without some transparency, without information. Information is power, and national security questions pose some special dilemmas and offer special challenges when you're trying to hold institutions accountable. For sure, big parts of what they do had to be secret, but when they make decisions in their kind of closed world that they're going to do something dramatically new, radically different from what has been done before, what has been sort of taken for granted as policy by the public for years, then that's something I think needs to be brought out. Gelman on national security. Now I'm going to see if I can play his voice here. Hang on.
So I guess I want to enable the normal checking powers that we say are important to us in the marketplace, in civil society, in politics, in law. None of those checks can operate without some transparency.
So without transparency, none of those checks can operate. I will continue here.
Information is power. And national security questions pose, some special dilemmas and offer special challenges when they're trying to hold institutions accountable.
So national security issues present us particular dilemmas for a reporter dealing with national security issues. Well said.
Yes. For sure, big parts of what they do have to be secret. But when they make decisions in their kind of closed world that they're going to do something dramatically new, radically different from what has been done before, what has been sort of taken for granted as policy by the public for years.
So again, a statement that, when the government's going to get radically different and do something different, they really need to let us know. They can't, otherwise you violate the auspices of transparency. In 2010, Gelman resigned from the Post to concentrate on long-form reporting and writing projects. He also secured a non-exclusive renewable freelance contract with Time magazine. He taught courses at Princeton and had an association with two policy centers in New York University. Eventually applied for, and in March 2013, would be a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, a nonpartisan think tank. Tradecraft. In dealing with classified materials and confidential sources, Gelman had learned how to protect his notes. Since at least 9/11, and probably before that, I've been very concerned about leaving digital trails to my sources, Gelman says. Over the years, I've taught myself how to use the privacy and security tools that are out there and how to come up with a much more secure workflow to make it harder to get at my notes and to find out who I'm talking to. He used anonymity software, which disguised his digital footprint, his network identity and web address, and encryption software, which scrambled the content of communications online while it's wending its way to its recipient. During their fellowship, Gelman had taught Poitras how to encrypt her material, both online and on her computer, so receiving an encrypted email from Poitras was not unusual. Quotes, I know her to be a very cautious and level-headed person, end quotes, Gelman said. Quote, she said, please don't bring your phone, end quote. So I knew when she said confidential, she meant really confidential. Cell phones, even when turned off, could be turned into a recording device without the owner knowing. Wow, the plot thickens. Intriguing first impressions. The pair agreed to meet at a cafe in Manhattan's Soho district at an appointed time. From there, they moved to another venue and talked over coffee. Poitras told Gelman that in late December 2012, she had been contacted by an unidentified individual who purported to be a member or closely connected to the U.S. intelligence community. The person seemed purposely vague, but promised sensitive information about the National Security Agency. The NSA was a defense intelligence agency established in 1952, but its origins dated back to code-breaking work conducted during the World War II. The NSA was charged with monitoring, analyzing, and decoding foreign data and information. It was Poitras's impression over multiple exchanges that the anonymous individual was determining whether he or she could trust Poitras to publish the information she or he had to offer. The person apparently was trying to establish whether Poitras could be discreet, was skilled at using privacy and security software, was competent to understand classified material, and would be interested in writing about it. The contact had reached out to her because of her independence from mainstream media, her documentaries, and her problems with U.S. customers. The stranger wrote, you probably don't like how this system works. I think you can tell the story. The contact expressed special concern that a news organization under government pressure might fail to publish what he or she had to tell. She or he cited as an example the New York Times and its 1-year delay in publishing the Rise and Lichtbau NSA story, originally scheduled for just before the November 2004 presidential election. The source seemed to trust Poitras to make material public. For her part, Poitras was trying to determine whether her contact was a crank or someone perpetrating a hoax. Even more chilling, this person could be someone trying to plant something false that could incriminate or embarrass her. With each message mentioning secret surveillance programs, the person claimed to have proof. Familiar with Gelman's extensive work and knowledge of national security and surveillance issues, Poitras sought his advice. Poitras and Gelman talked at the cafe for a couple of hours about what Poitras knew and how he might help her. She had seen no documents, but worried that if the source was legitimate, the story could be too much for her to handle alone. When they parted, Gelman didn't think much would come of it, but he was intrigued. Quotes, this is already in the top sort of 1% of blind tips I've ever seen, end quotes, he says. What's more, the informer had told Poitras she or he was willing to reveal his or her name once a story on classified documents was published. Quotes, normally people aren't, end quotes, explains Gelman. Quotes, if they won't tell me or if they won't let me tell the world, then authenticating and telling readers why they should believe this information becomes much harder. Gelman left the meeting believing that the person seemed legitimate, but that confirming facts would be difficult. It looked frankly like the kind of thing that you would have to put a lot of time and energy into, might not pay off, he says. For now, the story belonged to Poitras. Gelman, however, offered to help. They agreed to tackle the next phase together. Pieces of the puzzle. Gelman made it a practice always to try to deduce a source's situation and motivation. Where did the source stand on the hierarchy of the organization and at what stage in a career? Was it a source, an embittered late career individual seeking to settle scores, or a loser in some policy debate, or someone who wanted to undermine a hated boss? But the first step in this case was to verify whether the source had any credibility at all. So Gelman devised a system. He suggested questions for Poitras to ask, to which Gelman already knew 80% of the answer. That way, Gelman could tell whether the person knew what he or she was talking about and might even glean a little more information in the process. The first responses were encouraging. For one thing, the source used covert program names correctly. I noticed that when the person used covert terms that I knew, the person used them right. Says Gelman, for example, Stellar Wind was a series of warrantless surveillance programs conducted during the Bush administration. The NSA typically combined two words in one and capitalized all letters. The new word was then abbreviated at 3 or 4 letters for internal use. Thus, Stellar Wind became STLW. The source mentioned STLW, not the full word. Gelman had not used the shorthand in this book about Cheney, and he could find no reference to the abbreviation when he checked the web. One of the things about delving into a subject for a while is things you don't ever publish. They can become meaningful at a time like this, where you say, this person actually does seem to be displaying some inside knowledge, said Gelman. Voices began passing verbatim questions and answers between Gelman and the source. To each question, the source's answers were methodical and articulate and demonstrated a breadth of knowledge. All the while, Gelman was getting a bigger picture. The insider continued to use NSA terminology and, more importantly, admitted to not knowing certain things. That's always encouraging in a source. A source who doesn't claim to know everything, says Gelman, in a sign of confidence in Gelman and even demonstrating a sense of humor. The source nicknamed him Brass Banner. The source in turn adopted the pseudonym Verax, Latin for truth teller. Gelman and Poitras had not yet received any documents. By April, however, Gelman believed they would come and that document would be a big deal. They were most likely classified special compartmented information, a category above top secret. Under that classification, even someone with the highest security clearance could see compartmented material only on a need-to-know basis. Meanwhile, the subject was slowly coming into focus. Verax was suggesting that large private American communications companies were cooperating with the NSA and hinted at their names. Make a list of the top 5 or 10 internet companies and they'll probably be on the list, Verax wrote. Gelman became more specific in his questions about the documents themselves. Who's writing it to whom? For what purpose? What's the subtext? What's the context? What's the motivation of the document writer? Is this a pitch for more budget? Is it bragging to Congress? And how do you imagine that I could possibly authenticate that what's said in the document is true? Verax suggested that Gelman could find a couple of sources cleared for special compartmented information in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Digital Intelligence Technology Unit. Even for a veteran national security journalist like Gelman, that would not be easy. He also started to ask more probing personal questions. What's the worst thing people are going to say about you once they know what you're doing? Why are you doing this? Aren't you worried that you're going to be blowing secrets that could do harm to the American national security? Gelman still had no idea who the source was. At this point, I still do not know who Verax is, Gelman says. I want to understand more than I can tell my readers about the sources, is so that I can find a way to triangulate the truth. I don't care what anybody's motives are. I don't care whether they're a good person. I don't whether they have absolutely ill intent. If you're telling me something that's true and important, I just need to figure out which part of what you're saying is true and which is important. And that's why it's important. Prism. Finally, in mid-May, Verax sent Poitras and Gelman a single document and soon thereafter others, which they had not expected. The two reporters decided to scrutinize the first one. First, a PowerPoint of 41 slides titled Prism. It was very recent, dated April 2013. They were amazed by its classification category. By executive order, there were 3 classification levels: confidential, secret, and top secret. This was above top secret. I knew this was going to be the most sensitive story I'd ever had, recalls Gelman. There have been a few times in my career when I have had information that was probably as sensitive or hardly classified, but never a whole document with those stamps on it. The Washington Post had never had in its possession. I don't believe in entire history a document with stamps like that on it. The Pentagon Papers were classified secret, which is actually what they used for Navy laundry instructions. Poitras and Gelman met to read the document together. Then they read it twice more. After several hours, Poitras said she understood 10% of it at most. I understood about a half of it by the end of that night, recalls Gelman. But getting the rest of it would be hard. Many of the slides were filled with bureaucratic jargon. While it took Gelman and Poitras time to understand the details of what they were reading, the presentation seemed to be a briefing for senior analysts in the NSA's Signal Intelligence Directorate. The slides described how the NSA, along with the FBI, had built systems to pull information about tens of thousands of people from 9 major U.S. internet companies by obtaining user data from the servers where it was stored. Rather than try to catch it on the fly as it crossed the internet, the government could extract all manner of foreign communication data, including chats, photos, emails, and documents that crossed those servers. PRISM, Gelman recognized, was unprecedented in scope. Intelligence agency could never before have obtained so much data so easily for a simple reason that the companies collected it, such as Google and Facebook, had not existed until recently. The technology that had swept the world into the digital age was as useful for government surveillance as it was for businesses and individuals. Now what? With the documents in their possession, Poitras and Gelman knew that they had an important story to tell the world. They decided to focus on PRISM program because they got that document first and had already discussed it in a hypothetical way with the source. The other documents would have to wait. First, however, they had to find the right outlet to publish the story. Then they had to contact government officials to seek, 1, confirmation that the documents were authentic, and 2, official comment. Exposure. All three, Poitras, Gelman, and Verax, felt an urgency about publication. By May, the parties had been in contact for some 3 months. Despite their precautions, it was entirely possible that Verax would be caught. Gelman was stunned to learn that Verax was reaching out to journalists while still working as an NSA contractor and continuing to extract information from classified systems. Intelligence employees and contractors signed a contract promising never to disclose classified information. The person is trying to drop a dime on the surveillance state without being surveilled, Gelman said. The stakes were high. Verax feared exposure any day. Don't push the wrong buttons. For his part, Gelman worried that Verax would vanish. Now I'm asking questions because I'm always afraid that each communication will be the last, Gelman says. What if Verax were caught? What if she or he became unreachable close to the publication time? At the same time, Gelman could not rush unduly. It would take time to contact a news outlet, win its confidence, complete reporting on the story, and obtain government reaction. Direct line. On May 16, 2013, Verax finally opened a direct, encrypted channel of communication with Gelman. That sometimes corresponded by email, sometimes using cloaking technology. They communicated at length in real-time chats. Gelman became even more cautious, adding extra layers of protection when they were conversing, typing to each other, and when taking notes. Voice communication, Gelman says, is never secure enough. I had to make some decisions about whether I should keep notes at all, he says. Whether he kept, he was aware that the notes could be taken from him. As Gelman considered where to publish, he was careful to warn the Century Foundation, where he was a fellow, that he was involved in a risky enterprise. I'm getting caught up in something that's going to be very sticky and sort of stressful legally in terms of security, he told the foundation president. She expressed her support and even offered him legal counsel. Gelman opted not to accept the offer, fearing legal jeopardy for the foundation. Gelman did not have to ponder his choices long. He could have tried to go it alone and publish online. That seemed unwise. I knew that we were in a riskier time for sources and reporters on national security stories, he said. I knew that I was going to need legal representation, and I knew that I didn't want to be Barton Gelman, freelancer on this story. He could place the story with Time magazine, where he was affiliated, but he felt this article was a breaking news, would be better suited to a newspaper. In the end, the Washington Post seemed the obvious first choice. After 21-year association, Gelman knew the paper's editors well, and they knew him. I wanted experienced colleagues and a risk-taking institution behind me, clarifies Gelman. There was going to have to be an enormous amount of mutual trust in this journalistic relationship. I mean, I was asking people to believe that I had a confidential source whose name I did not yet know, but thought I should soon would, and that I had received these documents in a way that I described, and that they meant what I said they meant. Poitras reminded Gelman that Verax distrusted the mainstream media, so Gelman made his case to Verax. Verax asked pointedly, "What if Post balks?" "I admit to you that I do not know the new editor, Martin Barron," Gelman responded, "but his reputation is outstanding. He has already stood up to an enormous amount of pressure. If you're going to be an editor of the paper in Boston and take on the Catholic Church, that's pretty close to taking on God himself." Barron was Boston Globe editor when the newspaper broke the Boston Archdiocese sexual abuse scandal, for which it won a Pulitzer Prize in 2003. Gelman assured Verax and Poitras that if he disagreed with the Post on handling the story, or if they elected to publish only a small portion and hold the rest, he would simply walk away. "I had very firm ideas about how the story had to be handled," said Gelman. Enter the Post. Late Sunday night, May 19th, a tired Jeff Lean, investigative editor for the Post, answered his phone. Gelman was on the line. He wanted to meet about a national security matter but could not be specific on the phone. "It's urgent," Gelman told his former boss. "There might be only a few days to prepare a story." Gelman also asked if Lean could set up a meeting with executive editor Barron, who had taken the job only 5 months earlier on December 31st, 2012. "Well, I need to know more in order to get all this started," Lean recalls replying, and told Gelman to stay in touch. But when Lean woke up Monday morning, the tone and urgency of Gelman's voice had registered. Lean thought he even detected a note of fear. "I've got to get in touch with the paper right away," he thought, because in my subconscious the thing had percolated. He called Gelman back to arrange a meeting and apologized for seeming standoffish the night before. Gelman outlined his terms. Nobody could see him in the newsroom. He needed to meet with the Washington Post company chairman and CEO Donald Graham, and with the Post's in-house lawyers. Lean agreed, and on the morning of Wednesday, May 22nd, arranged for Gelman to enter the building undetected. Gelman met first with Graham for 5 minutes. "I know you don't get involved in newsroom details, and editors will tell you when they're ready to, but I'm bringing you what I think is pretty big, and an important story and a risky one, and I'm going to ask them if they want it and they want to embrace it fully," Gelman told the CEO. "And I want you to hear that from me. I hope they will stand behind me." Graham expressed his support and that of the Post. Lean took Gelman to meet with the managing editor, Kevin Merida, and two other senior editors. Also present were the newspaper's general and deputy general counsel and Kevin Bain, a partner at Williams and Connolly. This material was so sensitive that Bart Gelman felt we could only discuss it in the presence of lawyers because we need the attorney-client privilege to protect our conversations, says Lean. Neither the editor nor the reporter had ever made such an arrangement before. On the advice of lawyers, Lean took scant notes. To gauge the Post's appetite for risk, Gelman says he sometimes spoke hypothetically about what he had and did not reveal everything he knew. "I was very careful never to lie to them or mislead them, but I think that everyone was perfectly comfortable with me kind of unwrapping it one piece at a time," he says. The next morning, Thursday, May 23rd, Gelman met Barron for the first time. The editor had been on vacation. 3 lawyers and a few top editors joined the meeting. Gelman told Barron he had a secret source. "I don't know his name, but I expect to find out any day now." He said, "I'm probably not going to tell you right away, although he has told me that he expects us to unmask himself soon." Gelman said, I have a document that has scary stamps all over it. It's more highly classified than anything this paper's ever possessed. We all know what the legal environment is, and I need to know that I'm going to be fully under your umbrella on this. We're also going to have to walk carefully." Gelman then asked Barron to take a step that would demonstrate the Post's commitment. One of the lawyers said he could not advise Barron to agree, but Barron disregarded him and said, "Yes, that was a huge emotional moment for me," says Gelman. Barron's choice showed me that this was still the Post I remembered, willing to take risks for a big story and to share the risks that I was already taking. Gelman laid out the ground rules. He would need a private place to work. The number of people working with him would have to be limited. There would be no emails among them about the story until everyone learned to use PGP, a standard encryption tool. None of classified material could touch the Post servers or any other network. He had to convince the lawyers that writing attorney-client communication as subject line on an encrypted email did not prevent the government from intercepting and reading it. Everyone had to change their way of thinking about security and change their workflow a bit, he said. In the conference room and on the paper's network, Gelman walked the senior editors through the PRISM PowerPoint presentation and explained what he thought the story was going to be. Barron listened carefully. PRISM seemed like a policy shift on the part of the U.S. government to collect information in a way that was far more expensive than it had been before, recalls Barron. It vacuumed up a fair amount of communications by individuals who are not themselves specific targets of terrorism investigation or anything like it. It raised significant issues of individual privacy. I'm going to play Barron here again.
It seemed like a policy shift on the part of the U.S. government to collect information in a way that was far more expensive than it had been before. And that as part of that policy and that particular program, it vacuumed up a fair amount of communications by individuals who are not themselves specific targets.
So these individuals are not specific targets. They had their information vacuumed up, even though they were just fine, upstanding Americans, just happened to be in the middle of things.
Of a terrorism investigation or anything like that. And so it raised significant issues of individual privacy. It seemed to me that it was not a matter of just disclosing a particular program, a source or a method, but that it signified a part of policy shift on the part of the U.S. government.
So again, a departure from the norm, a departure, a radical difference in the way that the U.S. government has handled certain privacy issues in the past, and now that's what requires a release of the materials. That's how they're justified.
That had strong implications for individual privacy and constitutional rights. And so we're certainly interested in hearing more about it. It seemed like a policy.
So at least they were going to investigate further and discuss, because they believed that people's constitutional rights were being abused, and they were going to embrace this and look into it further. Barron gave Gelman the go-ahead and accepted his terms. They worked out the provisions of a short-term contract, including legal protection, because Poitras had been the initial point of contact and developed Verox as a source. Gelman felt she deserved to share a byline and should have a similar contract. What she did bring was way beyond what people need for a byline, says Gelman. Barron asked for a chance to meet her. He and Lean also both took a look at her documentaries and journalism. The next day, Friday, May 24th, Poitras joined Gelman for her first meeting at the Post. The editors accepted the request to give her a byline. She had run-ins with the government, but so do a lot of reporters, said Barron. Bombshells. On that same Friday, Verox, in an email to Gelman, made a surprise declaration. The source wanted to embolden others to step forward by setting an example of coming forward and seeking asylum in a country like Iceland, with strong internet and press freedoms. For the time being, Verox announced she or he was in Hong Kong, and at the same time, Verox stated that he or she had no intention of giving documents to a foreign government. Gelman was startled to learn where Verox had gone. That was the most stressful moment of the whole story, he says. I was glad to hear from Verox, but it was alarming to discover that he was overseas under the jurisdiction of one of the U.S. government's primary intelligence targets. I did not know Verox well and had no proofs of his intentions. Verox was out of the country, but now became more anxious than ever that the material be published before his or her departure was noticed and acted on. Verox wanted Gelman to guarantee that the newspaper would publish all of the PRISM slides within 72 hours. The source said the Post was taking too long and expressed concern that lawyers were involved. She or he wanted Gelman and Poitras to fly to Hong Kong so they could meet him in person. Gelman, however, could not promise what the Post would publish nor when. As to the Hong Kong, the editors, lawyers, and Gelman discussed the editorial legal risks and benefits of a trip. It was a close call, recalls Gelman. I decided to stay back and work on reporting out and writing the PRISM story instead. Gelman did worry that knowing where Verax was physically located might in some way jeopardize their communications. He consulted the Post lawyers twice a day on this and other matters. Interesting. Okay, reporting the story. Meanwhile, Gelman worked on the story alone. He was either sequestered on the 7th floor of the Post building or wrote in his hotel room. He faced the daunting task of authentication and verification. Over weeks of studying the PRISM document with Poitras, he had understood more and more of it, but he wanted to feel confident about it. As he told Barron, I'm morally certain that my source is for real and that this document is authentic and that what it says is true. I'm morally certain of that. But I'm not telling you right now that I could vouch for it in a way that you should publish it. We still have to get there. In the best case scenario, Gelman would make contact with various sources to gain insight into the slides and then ask the NSA for comment. He hoped its response would be along the lines of, we'd like a chance to tell you why you shouldn't write that story. That alone would authenticate the PRISM program. But first, he and Barron had to decide what to leave unpublished. Several slides gave examples of PRISM in use, provided names of targets, email accounts, and what had been learned. Such material, the journalist decided, should remain classified. The potential harm seemed high, and the value for public policy debate seemed low, comments Gelman. Gelman sent unencrypted emails to two of his contacts. One was a senior person in the White House. The second worked in the intelligence community. A very highly sensitive story that you're going to want to know about and want to talk to me about, he wrote. Tell me how you'd like me to proceed. I'm going to say it here. The message got the government's attention. Gelman got a phone call. Not from either of his two contacts, from a high-ranking official in the executive branch. What's up, the official asked the reporter. Why don't you go get a copy of the document with this title, this author, this date, and then let me know how you'd like to proceed, Gelman says he responded. The official called back, document in hand. Now that you've read it, Gelman told him, I imagine you have a lot of concerns. So I think we can shorten the conversation somewhat when I tell you that everything between pages 17 and 24 were not even considered published. The official seemed relieved. He also acknowledged first implicitly and then explicitly that the document was in fact authentic. But he made it clear that the administration did not want the Post to do the story at all. With that request on the record, the two continued to go through the material. And there are several conversations that coped with the unsecured telephone line by making veiled references to the document. Typically, Gelman gave the official a slide number and specified a spot on the page. Gelman also checked with his own sources. As he neared the end of this authentication process, other reporters were brought in to call the 9 internet companies for comment. Public relations representatives at Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, AOL, Skype, YouTube, and Apple all denied having any knowledge about PRISM. Gelman was not surprised. The denials were carefully ambiguous. There was no reason for companies to know the cover name PRISM, and spokesmen probably were not cleared to know anything. Each gave the Post vague, brief, prepared statements. We were trying to reconcile the company statements and the evidence we had from the NSA about what was going on, remembers Gelman. Competition. Poitras, meanwhile, had been in touch with the freelance national security journalist and constitutional lawyer Glenn Greenwald, whose work often appeared in The Guardian, UK. The two became acquainted when Greenwald in 2010 wrote a piece about her detainment at airports for Salon. Verax had told Gelman and Poitras that he had sought out Greenwald first in late 2012 in an email dated December 1st, 2012. Cincinnatus, another name chosen by the source, wrote, the security of people's communications is very important to me and asked Greenwald to use encryption software known as PGP, or pretty good privacy, so that they could communicate. Greenwald, who had contacted regularly by all kinds of people purporting to have government secrets, had rudimentary technical skills. He chose not to follow up. Verax, however, wanted to involve Greenwald and asked Poitras to try it. The source still worried that the material might Nazi publication and wanted to double the chances. On April 18, 2013, Poitras emailed Greenwald, who happened to be en route to New York City. The two met. Poitras showed him sample emails from Verax. After reading them, Greenwald was intrigued but skeptical. Plus, he knew Poitras was already working in the Post, and her reasoning that working with a newspaper in Washington, D.C. would get the federal government's attention. Nonetheless, at Poitras' prompting, Greenwald on May 20th contacted Verax. Just days later, after learning his whereabouts, Poitras wanted to go to Hong Kong to meet Verax, but not alone. Greenwald agreed to join her, and in the first days of June they flew to Asia. By then, Verax had given Gelman and Poitras some identifying details to prove his bona fides, and they knew his name was Edward Snowden. They also had his social security number, the Hawaii address where he had lived, and some details about his job history as a contractor for the NSA. All the information checked out. Gelman and his editors knew about Hong Kong trip and that the Post now faced immediate competition, so Gelman was not surprised when on Wednesday, June 5th, The Guardian published an exclusive by Greenwald NSA collecting phone records of millions of Verizon customers daily, revealing the first time that a Bush administration order had continued under the Obama administration. The story was based on a document from the same archive Snowden gave Gelman. The Post assumed that The Guardian would be interested in Prism's story as well. Gelman redoubled his efforts to fully vet the story for publication. Okay, so now we're getting to the end of this document. Let's take a look at how it winds up. Okay. The next segment, on hold. Throughout Wednesday, Gelman had several conversations with his government contact. They had arrived at an impasse. We flat out disagreed on the biggest ask the government made for this story. Gelman recalls they did not want the Post to publish the names of the 9 U.S. internet companies. Asked why the official claimed that disclosing the names might lead the companies to stop cooperating with Gelman, stood his ground. If the government's definition of harm was that the companies might change their policies in response to objections from customers, Gelman regarded that as more reason to publish. Gelman suggested that the official call the executive editor Barron if he wanted to plead government's case at a higher level. You're welcome to go straight up to the top of the line. Gelman told him it was standard practice at the Post for a reporter to handle official comments on their own stories. Editors became involved only if the government approached the paper. The official asked for more time to consult inside the government. The next day, Thursday, June 6, Gelman, exhausted and stressed, accidentally contacted Snowden on the wrong channel, alarming him. Snowden, by this point, was jumpy. He told Gelman the police had showed up that morning at the house and he had occupied until recently in Hawaii. Gelman told him the story would post online that day. Gelman had given his government contact a deadline of Thursday afternoon to make any final requests or arguments. He wondered whether the White House would indeed call Barron or Post Chairman Graham. By then, Gelman was no longer ensconced on the 7th floor. He had moved to the 5th floor newsroom, where he either huddled with Lean in his glass-walled office, going over the story, finally on the newspaper server, or sat in the newsroom talking to his government contacts. At Lean's urging, Gelman had written most of the story. The company information would be dropped in at the last moment. Lean did not want to pressure Gelman, but he too wanted to publish. Lean had to walk a fine line with Gelman, get what you need, but work as quickly as possible. It's not easy to do these investigative stories on deadline, says Lean. We knew we were in a competitive situation to get the story. I'm going to play Lean speaking here.
I think the process was that we knew that the information was competitive, and we also knew we had a pretty good idea what the information was, and so we were in a position where we could publish, but we were under a position where we needed to publish.
So they knew that this was a competitive deadline situation and that this is information, and they live on the prize of getting that information out there first. And we know that feeling here at Patriot Soapbox. So.
Dispatch, and so we knew we had the material that could make the Prism story. So what we needed was the government response, and so I think that he spent a fair amount of time in conversations with them before we published that story. That was part of the thing that it's not easy to do these stories on deadline. So my role was to make.
So they needed to get government verification, and they were trying to meet a deadline, which is very tough to do both at the same time. While Gelman waited, he made a final review of the government's arguments against publishing the company names. The government had told you shouldn't name these companies because it'll harm the government's relationship with those companies in a secret program. He recapitulates. Was that the real reason, or did the government worry that the companies would take a stock market hit? Did the White House fear a public opinion backlash? Of course the story would run. The public was entitled to know how NSA activities had changed, but Gelman wanted to be responsible and not gratuitously injure national security or needlessly revealed operational details. How could the story and the company's denials be true at the same time? If he did publish the company names, was that really a service to the readers? Did the public need to know? Okay, well, you can download this case at this website, and I'll make sure I get that link to you. But what are we concerned about here now? I mean, there's numerous concerns, and having held a security clearance which allowed me to look at this type of material, I must say that I probably would have had to shoot Snowden. That would have been my job. And so I understand his reasoning primarily, and I also understand the paper's reasoning. They think they're doing the noble thing. But security is security. And when you're a Marine, protecting the security of the information that protects the public is most important. So there are very difficult issues at hand here. What are we dealing with? We're dealing with someone who was an NSA contractor who signed numerous documents that said he would never do what he's doing and disclose the material. We also know from the Q drops that Snowden had clan connections, so that he had trained at the CIA prior. So this was an obvious operation where he had infiltrated the NSA and was outing this information on purpose, for whatever purposes they had. POTUS and Q are clearly stating now, handcuffs or parades. Well, that's the choice Snowden has, and this is the information that he released, is that, there were secret NSA programs that were, that deal with information. I mean, that's what they are, as the National Security Agency. That's what they deal with, this information. And, the covert collection of that information, covert or overt. Bill Binney has been very, very clear about this, and Bill Binney was a whistleblower. If you have problems with the agency that you're involved in, Bill Binney became a whistleblower in those circumstances. That's the legal way to do it. And that's what POTUS and Q have stated, is that, if you're a whistleblower, come forward, we'll listen. Snowden, on the other hand, went the other route. He violated every law and every premise of the documents and the things you swear to when you go to an agency. And then he turned it loose to the papers, which is, that's a unique choice. And you can only assume at that point that the reasoning for turning it loose to the papers was because of the damage that it would do. Why would it do that? Well, we're left to discover that answer on our own. And, I'd love to hear people's ideas. But I do want to bring up another issue here. And this issue, I think, is one of the major blockbusters. This all occurred in May of 2013, right? So we're talking, the springtime frame of 2013. If we put our thinking caps back on, we're in the Obama administration's, terms, second term. We're not near necessarily an election, but we are in a circumstance where now a newspaper that's known for taking risks is using encrypted technology to guard their sources, and is divulging again something that the government is doing it, and this paper has a history of outing government wrongs. And so in 2013, what happens to the Washington Post? Well, what amazed me was what happened to the Washington Post that fall. Amazon boss Jeff Bezos buys Washington Post for $250 million in August of 2013, folks. So 3 months later, 4 months later, Bezos, one of the techno-utopians, steps in and buys the Washington Post, which completely prohibits the Washington Post in the future from publishing this type of story, this risky type of story. It's now owned by the techno-utopians. It's now owned by the deep state. It's now owned and manipulated so that it will never release this type of information again. It's a frightening story, folks, that money, the right amount of money, can change everybody's mind. And 3 months later, after a company had done what they believed was morally correct in publishing the biggest story of violation of human rights, of our privacy rights, was purchased for $250 million and basically put to sleep, put out to pasture, so that they couldn't do it again. Well, that's what they've done with all the media, folks. The New York Times is an intelligence agency. It was owned by the Morgans throughout, and has been in the Sulzberger family for 100 years. Well, you can trace them right back to J.P. Morgan and right to London. So this has been another episode of Powerful Words of Caleb, and this brings up an enormous amount of Q drops and the answers to an enormous amount of Q drops. And so what I want to do for the last segment here is let's just go to the Q drops and type in a few words. Bear with me for a second while we change over. Okay, you know this always takes a few seconds to load, so let's contemplate this. We've got a CIA operative who goes to work as a contractor at the NSA and then outs a lot of compartmented information above top secret that tells a story that our government has been violating our rights through FISA and through non-FISA means, through the NSA and others. What do we do about it? Snowden's still running, to our understanding. He's been in Hong Kong. He's been in Russia. We're talking about our two major target nations. We don't know if he shared this information. He supposedly declared to Gelman that he would never do that. But how do you know that? We know that he shared it with WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks doesn't call and necessarily verify the information. They just put it out there. They don't follow the practices of the old world newspaper, the moral, double checking and triple checking. They just dump it out there and see what happens. So, what's this answer for us? Well, for me, it showed me exactly what occurred. It showed me that they were struggling with not only collecting this information, but that it was a premeditated affair, that he was still working there and he was reaching out to the media, specific media, with the intention of divulging this information. Planned, coordinated event over 3 months' time, chatting with these individuals, preparing for the release of it. Released the information to them, which was, a severe violation of intelligence policies and the law. Let's see if we can type in some keywords here and come up with something. Come on, slowness. The price of slow internet. We're waiting, we're feeding the pigeons. The electronic pigeons are being fed. Okay, well, we know for a fact that Snowden will come up many times. We know that the Washington Post will come up many times. And the missing componentry is here. There's no coincidence that Bezos from Amazon stepped in with an amount that he knew would be accepted and purchased this paper, which basically put their top secret story to bed. Right? I mean, that's basically, he silenced them. So we see how they've silenced the media. We see how they always circumvent our rights in some manner or another. And in this manner, they just purchase the media operation so that what comes out is only what they want to come out, correct? And this is not a coincidence. 3 months later after this story breaks that they purchased the Washington Post. So let's see if we can get Bezos here. Am I spelling his name right? Well, I'm going to stop share. This is kind of slow, folks. I don't want to put you through that. I'll do the research and I'll get the Q drops for you. But this is breaking information. This needs to get out there to you. And I do appreciate your time. I do thank you, as always, coming to another edition of Powerful Words with Caleb on Patriot Soapbox. And I look forward to new updates. Look forward to new material. This is a war, folks. This is the battle that we're in, and we can see that they're moving and jousting and taking up positions and taking strategic and tactical positioning that they need to defend their empire. And we're seeing that Bezos is just another character on the battlefield, and that they use money as their weapon. And so, with the Rothschilds and the world banking conglomerate throwing money around like it's water, it's really hard to get a fire going when they're constantly throwing more and more water on it. You can see how people just give in to greed. I mean, Washington Post, they stand for righteousness and journalism, getting the story out there, and yet within 3 months they're caving to the enormous amount of money that was offered. Thank you, folks, for coming in. I appreciate your time. Have a wonderful day or evening, whichever is appropriate.